So great to see all of you. It's a warmer Sunday. Thank you, Lord. And it's great to see all of you here. If some of you are wondering why the scruff, my wife is gone. And when my wife is away, the beard will stay. So I will not shave until I see her again, because though she likes the look of it, says, never touch me with that thing. So I then quickly shave it off. So that's the deal. So Marion's back in sunny, warm Atlanta, being a grandma and going crazy with our grandson. And we're wrapping up this series of Return to Robben Island. It's a series that has really been taking a look at how Israel had this propensity to want to go back to Egypt. And the reason why we called it Robben Island, could you imagine if you were one of the people set free and all of a sudden you decided, no, after my freedom, I just want to go back and live on that island. It would just not make sense at all. And it didn't make sense in the lives of the people of God either. Why would you want to go back to something that was slavery and oppression when you've been set free by God and enjoying this new freedom? It's a weird thing. But as we're going to see again, as we wrap this thing up, we do have this tendency to want to go back to what's familiar, to something that is we're used to. Even if it wasn't the greatest of situations, we want to go back to it. And we long to sort of have this taste of the familiar of our past. So that's what we're going to take a look at. I don't know how many of you are into the police drama TV shows, but I'm sure that many of you, or at least if you haven't seen them, you're familiar with the CSI sort of TV shows. There's CSI New York, there's CSI Miami, there's CSI New Orleans, and I started thinking to myself, could there be a CSI if it was in rural America? You know, like CSI Paducah, Kentucky, you know? I mean, would that have an appeal to a wide audience? Hey, Bubba, how'd he die? Death by moonshine. You know, I mean, it just probably doesn't translate as much than the urban kind of hip thing. But the CSI series is it's based on forensic science, where they literally take the body and they observe the body even before they do an autopsy. They take a look and they draw the physical evidence that is there, and then they actually cut into the body to find out what was going on. They can find, incredible things through the different ways in which this person experienced whatever trauma or foul play that was perpetrated on them. And so then they take all of that evidence and they not only say this is how the person died, when the person died, but they also can take some evidence to say this might actually be the evidence to apprehend this killer. And so that's what CSI is all about. And you may be wondering why I'm actually going into all of this science of forensics and post-mortem and autopsy. And the reason for that is because I'm going to do, and we are going to do, a CSI post-mortem on Exodus chapter 32. We're going to do a biblical autopsy to find out, in the words of Moses, what this people's great sin was all about. The people of God had committed a great sin. We know by observation that it was idolatry. They created a golden calf. But what was the cause of it? Where was the start of all of this? What was the motive behind this great sin? Verse 31, Moses says, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin." What was it? Take a look with me at Exodus chapter 32. I'm going to read the first 6 verses. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what's become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in your ears and of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast of the Lord." And they rose up early the next day, and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat, to drink, and rose up to play. What was the motive? What was the cause of this great sin? Before we even open up the body to see the internal evidence, the external evidence is enough for us to understand that there are 3 reasons why they committed this great sin. 3 reasons. And usually when you're doing an investigation, you're trying to answer questions. Who? When? Where? What? So, before we even cut into this, we're going to see why this great sin occurred. Who committed it? That's the first reason of why this was such a great sin. The who. The people of God, God's chosen people, his treasured people, people who had entered into a covenant relationship, not unlike and very similar to a covenant relationship between a husband and wife. This is an intimate covenant relationship. So the who was a contributing factor to this great sin. And then the when and the where they committed this sin. They committed this sin immediately after receiving this incredible covenant relationship where they promised to be God's people, God promises to be their God, and where it took place was at Mount Sinai. The place where God's glory descended in a cloud and the mountain was consumed with fire, but it didn't burn up. And they experienced this incredible presence of God. So the who, the where, and the when. And then the what. What was the third reason for this great sin? The what dealt with what these people had already witnessed and experienced as it related to the power of God. In other words, they had seen God's power. They had experienced, they had witnessed his signs and wonders of the plagues, that they had witnessed and lived the experience of going through the Red Sea and then watching the Red Sea close on their pursuing army of the Egyptians. They had experienced bitter water being turned sweet. They had experienced being fed by manna from heaven. They had experienced all of this. So the what was a contributing factor to this great sin. And you put all 3 of these things together, and they add up to a rebellious act against the goodness of God. Anytime you and I sin, it's a pushback against the goodness of God. You're saying, I want to do it this way. I want to do it my way. I want to cheat. I want to lie. I know it's not your way. I'm going to do it my, and all of a sudden it is a pushback on the goodness of God. And that's what they were doing. It was a massive, rebellious pushback on how God had been so good to them. But the question that still remains is why? We've answered the who, the when and the where, and the what. But why? Why? What was their motive? What was the cause of this? So now, scalpel, please. Let's cut in. Let's get the bone saw. Let's cut through the sternum. Let's get the rib spreader, and let's open up the chest cavity to see what was at the heart of this great sin. What got the thing started? And it's found in the first verse. When I was praying over and preparing this, I was like, Lord, I know this is about idolatry, but how did they get there? And I'm hoping that as we do this biblical autopsy, that you and I will be able to see these tendencies, these motives that were there that might actually be in us that would lead us into a place of great sin. I'm hoping that as we uncover some of these things, that we would find the evidence that would apprehend our motives and our causes that want to lead us to a great sin, a rejection of the goodness of God. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the word delayed. When we open up the chest cavity and we find out why this people at this particular time, this glorious moment in their history would commit this great sin, the why began with impatience. Impatience. Do you know what the definition of impatience is? Impatience is an inability to tolerate delay. It's an inability to tolerate delay. Semicolon, restless, semicolon, eager to take anxious action. In other words, these people, Moses had been up on the mountain for 40 days. We don't know where he is. He's a great guy, this guy who brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what's become of him. I mean, the guy's in his 80s. Maybe he's having a big senior moment and he got lost up there. I don't know. Maybe he's doing like a Rip Van Winkle and he fell asleep and now he's just been sleeping for 40 days. We don't know what's become of him, but we've grown impatient, and that impatience has caused a restlessness, and that restlessness is causing us to take an anxious action. We got to grab a hold and seize this moment because we're all alone in the wilderness. There are countless biblical characters who you could probably trace back to anxious impatience that caused them to make an impulsive, in-the-moment choice that led them into great sin. And I would dare say that all of us, yours truly, has been guilty of when I get anxiously impatient and restless. It leads me to take action. And I impulsively choose to do something that actually flies in the face of the goodness of God. We've all been there. Like we If you have your phone and you have this app. My kids all have it. I don't even know how to download it, but my kids have it. It's called Waze. Anybody have Waze? You're just like, yeah, there you go. You're just like, of course you have Waze, right? And you're just like, okay, this is okay. And Waze is going to tell me it's going to take. I'm going to go longer, but it's going to take 7 minutes less. And so now all of a sudden you take this different route. Which is nothing wrong, but that's what we do spiritually. We look for ways. And you know, the very first thing that I want you to know about in anxious impatience, we're looking for shortcuts. And I'm here to tell you, on the authority of God's word and personal experience, there is no shortcut that you can take to spiritual maturity. There is no shortcut that you can circumvent and fast track yourself to growth and maturity in faith in God. In fact, it's actually in the times of delay where God teaches you. But we look for shortcuts. We look for ways. And so this impatient anxiety led them to make an impulsive, sinful action. The next thing that I want you to know about anxious impatience is that it will take a believer away from trusting in God's will and his plan for their lives and his purpose for them, and they will hijack it and create their own agenda. I will trade God's perfect plan, his perfect timing, and we will trade it for our own limited capacity to understand our plan, our agenda in our time and in our way. So we transfer, we exchange those two. God was saying, it has always been my plan, it will be my plan, and I will fulfill my plan to take you from slavery to the promised land. We're now just going through this route called the wilderness. But don't worry, we're getting there. And we'll get there according to my time and my plan, because I'm working out things in you that need to be worked out. And that wasn't good enough. So what they do with anxious impatience, let's create our own agenda. Make us gods. And at the base of all of that, is the sin of self-reliance. God has not called you and I to live a life of self-reliance. He's called us to live a life of self-denial. Deny self. Put me above everything. And I will take you on a route that you may not understand, but it's the right direction. But when you and I feel that God's not coming to the party, he's not showing up, and here is a South African thing, we make a plan. We make a plan to make a plan. We make a plan to make a plan to make the plan. We're so good at it. It's so a part of us. And that self-reliant way says, I'm going to go back and trust my own gifts, trust my own experience, trust my own thoughts and the way in my own history of how things have gone before. And I'm going to base my going forward on my own limited experiences versus the eternal God who's existed forever. You see how pathetic it is, but we do it. And when we default to this self-reliant way and we get caught in this soulful restlessness, and we then move into this category of anxious impatience, we make an impulsive, in the moment action, we take the step, we do our own agenda, we put ourselves right back in jail. You go right back to Robben Island. You go right back to Egypt. You go right back to being enslaved to your own limited capacity versus God's limitless capacity and his beautiful freedom. We go right back to prison. The other thing that happens as I kind of went through this is, make us gods who shall go before us. Who shall go before us. You know, what they were getting nervous about, so that's what anxiety was, it's this worry, unrest. It was not that God had abandoned them, but all of a sudden that they felt like God was distant. So we need to create a God that is proximate. Been there? Done that. There's not a person who has ever walked in a relationship with Jesus who hasn't said this at some point: I just feel like God is distant. And I can tell you right now, if you're a believer in your first 5 years of walking with Jesus, you have said it, and if you haven't, you will. But the key word there is feel. I feel God is distant. Doesn't mean that God is really distant. You just feel he's distant. They felt that God was distant. And as for this Moses, our leader, he's gone walkabout. We don't know what's happened. So we've got to create something that is intimate and proximate right now, something that we can see, something that is tangible, something that we can relate to so that we can hang on to, because we want something that is truly present. We said earlier in this series, a couple months ago, as we were talking about prayer, that God is so proximate, he's so intimate, he's closer than your own breath. But times of anxious impatience will lead us to feel he's just distant. He lives somewhere over there in the East Rand, where you have to literally take a plane to get there. But for the New Testament believers, unlike these people who experienced God's presence in a cloud by day, a pillar by night, had witnessed his glory, his Shekinah glory cloud descending, who was with them, they felt distant. And then eventually, God's presence came in a tent. For us in the New Testament, the Holy Spirit is right. You can't get any closer. But when you do the autopsy and you start unpacking the tissues of feelings, I feel distant. I feel alone. And some people can go as far as going, gosh, I really feel God's actually left me and abandoned. And that's where they were. Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. When they finally arrived into, now I'm really taking us far, when they crossed the river, the Jordan River, they're in the land, they've taken possession of the land. In the last chapter of Joshua, Joshua says this to all the people: as I'm saying to you, now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Why? Because he's so good. Put away. You should, if you have a Bible, underline those two words. Put away. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Put them away. Stop going back. Stop defaulting to old ways, old patterns, old cycles, old thought processes, old flawed belief systems. Put those away and live in the newness and the freedom that God has given you, because his presence is with you. His plan is great. His purposes for you are glorious, and he's leading you to the promised land. Put those things away, because they'll take you right back to jail. But see, we long for the familiar. We long. And our minds can even get distorted. That theirs were actually, at this point, going, they weren't literally saying physically, let's go back to Egypt, although we've seen that in the last few weeks. Now they're saying, and this is why it's such a heart condition, let's go back to something that's familiar. Let's go back to something familiar. I've had many conversations with South Africans on a plane, because you have a long time, 16 hours back and forth from America to talk. And I will, almost every trip I take, wonder if this is the case with you, Rich, I'll encounter a South African who's moved to America, and they're coming back for a visit. And then they'll find out why I'm here, and they will say, I don't get that. Why are you here? And we'll start to talk, and they'll say why they left, and so on and so forth. And I've had several conversations, not all of them, several, where they go, man, you should have been in my country years ago. It was so good. It was so good. It was almost like they're saying, these were the good old days. And I'm going, that's because you're white. I mean, it was good for you if your skin was white. It wasn't so good if your skin wasn't. You long for the good old days. You long for an oppressive, fascist, conservative government that literally protected 10% of the population at the expense of the 90% of everybody else suffering? No, those weren't good old days. Those were not good old days. And if you're one of those old guys like me, because I'm old now, who go, oh man, I just long for the 80s. No, we don't. We dressed weird. We looked funny. I mean, my gosh. I mean, seriously? Anytime you want to default to something familiar in your past, it keeps you from going forward in your future. And that default has such a grip. And then when it comes to old ways and old patterns, this is where we're going to get a little bit more serious. Because putting away your idols, if you don't, you're in jail. If you don't put these things away, and your idol can look very different from the person sitting next to you and the person in front of you and behind you, because your idol can actually be a default mechanism for you to cope. It's your operating system. It's actually become so interwoven into your DNA that when we do the autopsy on your spiritual life, it is so interwoven to those old ways, those old patterns of thinking and believing, that you and I can't really begin outside of Christ's power, which I'll talk about in a minute. You can't disconnect them. You don't have the power. You don't have the capacity. You're not that smart. You're not that wise. Even if you've identified it, yep, anger's my issue. Or that bottle is my issue. Or that joint is my issue. Or that person, she meets my needs. That guy is my satisfaction. I'm telling you, none of those things actually will add up and fulfill you and bring you the safety, the security, and the satisfaction that you're longing for that can only be found in God. And what happens tragically is whatever it is that you're going back to will actually ultimately betray you. Because that's what idols do. Idols betray you. They're treasonous. Because they can't stand under the weight. Because they're a created thing. They're a created being. Only the Creator can stand and has the power to shoulder your need for satisfaction and peace and security and so on and so forth. Only God can fully, completely, powerfully love you. So your idol that you run to in those familiar things will take you back to a place that will just keep locking you up. And you'll go into lockdown mode. And God is saying, don't do that. Personal story. I shared with you on a couple of different occasions that for the first 27 years of my life, I was a man motivated, completely dominated by fear. On the outside, they have a term for it. It's called the performance trap, where you just have to perform at such a high level. Why? Because you want everybody to see that you're a high achieving guy and that you actually can really show up and you're number one. Well, that's what you would let everybody think. But really at the bottom of that was, for me in particular, was I had a terrible, debilitating fear of failing. And if anybody saw me as a failure, that was the most crushing blow you could ever do to me. So I actually put myself under the weight of my own pressure of living. And I didn't know that I was a man of fear. I would have said, hey man, I'm pretty courageous. I'll step out. I'll take you on. Let's go. I was a fighter. I was tenacious. But I was motivated by the fact that I just can't have anybody see me anything less. And I can't see myself in any other way. Man, was it a trap. So in my pastor's study, who happened to also be my boss, as I was working for a church, we were praying, Marion was with me, and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit knocked me to my knees, and I had to confess before my pastor and for my wife and before God that I was a man completely 100% dominated by fear. And in that moment, and by the way, it was like a tug of war. I didn't want to say that because that was weak. And I wouldn't appear weak in front of my wife or my boss. And God called me to voice it out. And once I voiced it out, in that moment, God completely delivered me from fear. Now, here's the thing that you need to dial into. When God delivers you, and he delivers you and I from everything at the cross, in terms of our sin. And then on the journey, he'll start to go, I need to get at that anger. I need to get at that fear. I need to get at that old way of your going back. I need to get at that. And when God gets at it and you give it to him, what you have to do at that point is you actually have to unlearn your old ways. Because you have to learn new ways of this freedom that he's ushered you into. So that was on a Sunday. The next Sunday, I was leading this very large youth ministry in the city of Atlanta. And I went right back into my pregame mode that I always did. And that was, I wonder if anybody's going to come. Wonder if anybody's going to like what I say. Wonder if, and I just started going into those old ways. And God in that moment said, stop it. That's the old you. That's the fearful you, Glenn. I released you from that. Live in the new freedom. And you just preach the word to who's ever there. And if it's 3 kids or it's 3,000, you just faithfully do it in my name and I'll show up. And it was one of the most freeing things I have ever experienced. But I had a default to go right back to that old pattern. Will people like me? Will I measure up? And then I'd have all the excuses ready if people didn't come. Oh, well, there was a big concert that, and and it's like, no, stop all the excuses, stop everything. And it's just like, I'm here. This is what you got. Jesus called me to, and I'm going to be here, and I'm going to share with you the truth of God's word. Who's in? Man, was that freeing. See, that's what you got to get at. So those are the things you got to put away. What is it? And I'm looking at all of you. What is the thing that God is calling you to put away? Seriously. Because if you don't get serious about it, it will put you right back there. Then for a little bit of comic relief, we turn to the end of this chapter, and Moses comes down the mountain, he sees what's going on, and he says to Aaron in verse 21, Moses said to Aaron, what did this people do to you that you brought such a great sin upon them? And Aaron, in classic Christian ways, lies, and he blames. Aaron said, let not the anger of my Lord burn hot. You know these people. They are set on evil. He blames them. You know what impatient, fearful anxiety will do? It will deflect blame and put it somewhere else. You will not own it. Then he goes on to give what I think is the classic comical excuse in all of the Bible. I mean, it's just funny. For these people said, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So I said to them, let any who have gold take it off. So they gave it to me. I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. And Moses is like, it's a miracle. You got to be kidding me. Moses was 80, Aaron's his older brother, and he's still in his late 80s, possibly early 90s, doing a teenage, I don't know how that got broken. Well, the lamp was intact when Mom and I left. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the lamp got broken. I think it was broken before you were born. It just cracked. I don't know. Like, come on. Or the people that will make the excuses. I don't know. It's like I've had to counsel kids who've gotten pregnant, teenage kids. You're like, okay, let's go back and find out, how did this happen? I don't know. We were just sitting on the couch watching TV, and the next thing I know, our clothes were off. That's a miracle. Your clothes just flew off your body. Is that what you're saying to me? Is that what you're going to stick with? Well, okay, maybe not flew off our body, but we got lost in the moment. An impulsive act. Why? Because they didn't want to patiently wait for the one that God has for them. And there's just so much that can come back to this. So let me conclude with the remedy. There's also another TV show. It's called The Walking Dead. And here's, in all seriousness, I think too many Christians are walking dead. You know why? Because they're walking around with their own disappointment, with their own discouragement because of some past sin that they can't get out of, and it just keeps swirling them down to what Duncan talked about last week, into despair. And I'm here to say, now there's hope. And there is a remedy for the walking dead. These people, Israel, and you and I, and one person that we're going to take a look at in the New Testament, needed a new vision of God's glory. That's the remedy. They needed a new vision of God's glory. You and I need constantly a new vision of God's glory. Otherwise, we'll keep defaulting back. Or our past sins and our heritage of sinful acts and thoughts and, bad choice begets bad choice, and you're going, I just can't get out of this. I keep swirling back. We need, they needed a new vision of God's glory. For them, Moses came down, went back up to the mountain, prayed over them, interceded, and came back down, and his face glowed with the glory of God, reflected. And they saw a new vision that God was saying, oh, gloriously, we see it reflected in your skin, that God is still with us, and he's going to take us forward. In the New Testament and for us, and I'm telling you, this isn't just something for a Sunday. This isn't something for a Christian conference or a Christian camp or retreat. Those are great. This is something that you and I daily need to come back to if we're going to have victory and live in this beautiful new freedom. You need a new vision of the glory of God, and I'm telling you what you need to see, what I need to see on a daily basis is the resurrected Jesus. If you go to the resurrection Jesus, then all of a sudden you go, oh wait, that's freedom. That's hope, because he took that great sin, he took my sin, he took those patterns, he took those false beliefs, and he nailed them to the cross, and he took them down to the grave, and he buried them, and he left them there. Amen. And now he's risen, and I need to see on a daily basis this beautiful new vision of the glory of the resurrected God, because it reminds me my past has been dealt with, my present is conquered, and my future is hopeful. Peter was in need of a glorious new vision of Jesus. He had denied Christ 3 times. What did he do? When Jesus was gone, he went right back to his old ways. They went fishing. They're on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus shows up. He must have been a South African, because he had a fish fry going on on the beach. Sure. Did you catch anything? No, we haven't caught anything all night. Yeah, Sprue, put your nuts on the other side. Some of you are going, nice try, Glenn. And they pull in this great catch. And when they pull in this great catch, which is a glorious example of a supernatural miracle, John turns to Peter and goes, it's the Lord. Peter puts on his outer garment, jumps in there. They're only less than 100 meters from shore. He wades in, and all of a sudden, they enjoy the fish fry. And after they finish eating, this is the conversation. And the one who denied Jesus 3 times needed a new vision of God's glory to be restored so that he could live out God's mission and purpose for his life. When they had finished the breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. Listen, he didn't call him Peter here. This is like when your dad says, Glenn Robert Campbell, and you're like, yes. But Jesus wasn't scolding him. Jesus was restoring him. He was saying, who you are, I'm going to call you by name. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. 1. He said to him, then feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to them, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, and here is when he gets the vision of God's glory, because he now expresses Jesus's omniscience. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I'm here to tell you, in the beauty of this remedy, of having a new vision of God's glory, right now your life can change. And it is a daily thing that I do before God every day, where I have pushed back on the goodness of God, defaulted to my own self-reliant ways, gotten anxious and impatient and restless, and made decisions that are impulsive. And in my humility, I come and I say, Lord God, cleanse my heart and let me see the resurrected Jesus. With the eyes of my heart, let me see him, because when I see him, I know with certainty and hope that all of this was nailed to the cross, and I can rise in the beautiful freedom. And he can say, now Glenn, go love my sheep, tend my lambs, feed them. That's what he wants to do with you. Let us stand.